satisfies? You believe in a God that opens eyes? You believe in a God that tells you lies? Or do you believe in me? Do you believe in a God that brings you down? Do you believe in a God that wears the crown? Do you believe in a God that makes you bow? Or do you believe in me? Do you believe in a God that satisfies? You believe in a God that opens eyes? You believe in a God that tells you lies? Or do you believe in me? Do you believe in a God that brings you down? Do you believe in a God that wears the crown? Do you believe in a God that makes you bow? Or do you believe in me?
It's Beyond Common Sense. It's Lanny Sense with Lanny Swerglo, KCAA's resident gay, woke, liberal, pot-smoking, race-mixing, tree-hugging, left-handed, science-affirming, Jewish, humanist, atheist, a white evangelical Christian nationalist, worst nightmare. And here I am today with you in the KCA studios here on June 11th. A wonderful day. I guess it's been gorgeous out where we are. But you know, it's an interesting day because of Hunter Biden. That's right. Hunter Biden got convicted on all three charges, gun charges. And you know who's the most disappointed? The Republicans, because they were all ready to see Hunter Biden go free, and they were going to sit there and jump up and down about the Department of Justice and how it's only going after Republicans and that kind of stuff. Well, now they can't. The Department of Justice has got the president's son convicted on a drug charge. A drug charge because he lied about his drug use while he's getting a gun. And, you know, I was reading this article. This senator, a Republican senator, said, oh, this is wrong. He said he shouldn't be convicted on a drug charge. They should convict him of something else, but not on a gun charge. A gun charge, he should be able to get, you know, this gun stuff is absolutely nutso to me. You know, I am not a friend of the Second Amendment. In fact, I think the Second Amendment is wrongly interpreted. The Second Amendment talks about a well-regulated militia, and if you belong to a well-regulated militia, you can have a gun. But it doesn't mean you can have a gun anywhere you want. And this gun stuff in this country has gone absolutely nuts. There is more guns in this country. There is people. And you know what's the worst part? You know what used to be the number one cause of deaths of children under the age of 18? The number one cause was car accidents. And you know what the number one cause of children's death today in the United States is? Guns. And yet we want people to have as many guns as they want. We want them to get it easily, and we want to get it cheaply. It's absolutely insanity. And now we have the president's son, a felon. I don't know if it's a felony, but he's been convicted on saying that he wasn't a drug addict when he tried to get a gun. Crazy. Well, anyway, speaking about the President Biden and stuff, I want to mention one of the reasons, a good reason to vote for President Biden is because of Vice President Kamala Harris. That's right. She is a fantastic person. When she was Attorney General here, did a great job and this kind of stuff. You know, she's been getting some criticism from cannabis people that she went after cannabis people when she was Attorney General. No, that is not true. When she was Attorney General of California, the AG does not convict anyone. Local prosecutors do. AGs are responsible for enforcing California's laws, not overriding them. Yes, Kamala was opposed into a 2010 legislative initiative known as Proposition 19. But any responsible AG would have done so too. The initiative was really carelessly written so as to pose formidable enforcement problems for the state. For example, under Proposition 19, West Hollywood could have made it legal to grow and sell a ton of marijuana. And being West Hollywood, they probably would have allowed you to grow a ton of marijuana. But if you moved 1 ounce of that marijuana over 2 feet into Los Angeles, you'd be guilty of a felony. Just absolutely a really badly written initiative. It's too bad it didn't pass. I mean, but eventually we got 64, which was much better written, although it does have its problems as well. But before being AG, Kamala was the district attorney for San Francisco. Again, the DA is responsible for enforcing the existing laws and rarely gets involved in individual cases, especially drug offenses. But Kamala continued the liberal policies of her predecessor with regards to marijuana, including keeping her hands off the city's many, many, many medical marijuana collectives, which have been and were prosecuted in many other jurisdictions. So, hey, Kamala Harris, that's one of the good reasons to vote for Joe Biden, many else as well. Okay. Do want to mention that we just had a wonderful victory in the city of Temecula. We think it's a victory. We're pretty sure it's a victory. The city of Temecula, the Temecula School Board was taken over by a group of right-wing Christians from a mega church there that kind of snuck them through in one of these elections. And, these down-ballot elections are kind of ignored, and they got these crazy Christians sitting on the board, and they did things like critical race theory, even though they don't teach critical race theory, and they were going after the LGBT kids and making life miserable for them and banning books and all this kind of crazy stuff. Well, one of them resigned, and the people in Temecula just got fed up with the president, and they had a recall petition, and they recalled him, and the results are in, and it appears that this guy, his name is Joseph Kaminski, has been recalled. And so they're going to have new elections, and hopefully this time they'll get some people who are concerned about their children and their education in Temecula and not about the culture wars, which is what all these people were. And they had all kinds of lawsuits. It cost the city, the Temecula School Board, a lot of money. So that's one of the good things to know. But one of the best things to know is our guest tonight, Michael Krawitz. I've known Michael for many, many years, and he is literally one of the unsung heroes of the cannabis reform movement. He's worked in the background. He hasn't gotten the adulation that I really think he should, and I'm so pleased that he's going to be our guest on the show tonight. Now, I'll give you a little background on Michael. He is a disabled United States Air Force veteran. He was a sergeant from 1981 to 1986. He serves as executive director of Veterans for Medical Cannabis Access, as well as other boards and advisory roles. He's on more boards and more advisory roles than I can stake a stick at, I can tell you. After California's historic Proposition 215, Michael observed that cannabis used as a palliative adjunct pain treatment to opiates not only produced better pain relief, but also significantly lowered the number of pain pills used. And that's one of the big things about cannabis. People who are on these opiates, if they use cannabis, they can significantly reduce the amount of opiates they use, if not stop them altogether. Leading the Veterans for Medical Cannabis Access, Michael successfully negotiated the first ever Veterans Administration medical cannabis policy in 2010. 2010, that was almost 15 years ago, and he got the VA to recognize the medical benefits of cannabis. And since he's overseen the World Health Organization process in Geneva and then the United Nations process on the WHO cannabis recommendations. The successful vote on December 2nd, 2020 in the United Nations, which was taken in Vienna and Austria, moved cannabis and cannabis resin from the Single Conventions Treaty, quote, most dangerous drug category, end quote. So it was still, recognized as an illegal drug, but this fear that it's the most dangerous drug and it's going to kill you and everybody, it took it away. And he did that. And there wasn't much publicity about that, and I think that was a major accomplishment. In 2021, Michael was appointed to serve on the Virginia Cannabis Public Health Advisory Board for 5 years, which means he is still serving on it right now. The Virginia Cannabis Advisory Board has oversight over the Virginia Cannabis Control Authority on any regulation impacting public health. So maybe we'll find out a little bit about it. But what we're mainly going to talk about is the rescheduling of cannabis. Michael, welcome to tonight's show.
Well, thanks, Lanny. It's great to be here. It's been a while.
It certainly has. The last time I think I saw you was in Washington, D.C. at a Americans for Safe Access conference.
Could be.
Yeah, we were up on the roof there getting stoned. It was really a lot of fun, a lot of fun. Anyway, let's talk about you before we get into the meat of all this kind of stuff. Let's talk a little bit about you. How long? What got you going into cannabis? How were you always using it, or is it something happened in your life that brought it about?
Well, cannabis for me, it's sort of two different lifetimes. The cannabis in the first lifetime was me growing up right outside of New York City in a little suburb in New Jersey, which was like ground zero of the cannabis experience in the 1970s. And I think movies were made about my area where I grew up, marijuana movies, like Fast Times at Richmond High or whatever. But yeah, we had literally a couple of thousand kids out in front of the high school smoking pot before school, and cops just there to make sure nobody got hurt. And that was kind of a cool truce we had, I guess, back in '76, whenever it was. But I actually left all that and went in the military and got hurt. If I hadn't gotten hurt, quite honestly, cannabis and I probably wouldn't have crossed paths again for many more years. I will say this, looking back at it from this perspective that I have now, I think it was very close. It wasn't very a crazy idea that I might have had a different life path if I just met different people. If I met Michael Aldrich and Michelle Aldrich, I was on the wrong coast to meet them back in the mid '70s, right? But had I learned, even if I had met Bob Randall and learned some of the stuff from him, maybe I would have had a different life path. Maybe I wouldn't have gone in the military. Maybe I would have gone right into the cannabis movement. But as it is, I went in the military and I had a career path, and it wasn't for getting injured. I wouldn't have been pulled back into the cannabis world, but I was pulled back into the cannabis world, but this time as a patient seeking treatment. And really, after I'd already been through the meat grinder, 13 surgeries or whatever after an accident that I had when I was in the Air Force, that I finally found cannabis as just like you said in my bio, as an adjunct pain treatment.
How did you come to discover that cannabis? I mean, when you used cannabis in high school, it was for fun. How did you come to discover that cannabis had pain relieving properties?
Well, here, before I answer it personally, let me just say that I think to this day it was a tragedy that my dad, was a World War II vet, and I remember hanging out with him on the porch while he was just sort of gritting his teeth and getting through the day after being given a chemotherapy shot. And that was like 1978, 79. I could have, marijuana was just everywhere, but I didn't give him any, and he didn't think to use any. That's what I was saying about if I had met Bob Randall earlier, right? Maybe I would have known to be able to help my dad, not suffer so much through that time. He had the medications that they gave him at the hospital or whatever, and they obviously weren't helping him really one bit. Cannabis might have really given him some relief, and he made it through the treatments. Bless him. But he really, he had to really work hard. But in my treatment, actually, it was a split screen. So you can picture the Veterans Affairs doctor on one side of the screen, and they're telling me literally, we'll give you anything out of the pharmacy, just don't smoke marijuana. And then I had a doctor that I had seen when I was traveling abroad over in Holland, over in Netherlands, and he gave me almost the exact opposite advice. He said, I can now prescribe cannabis. We've got a new program here. This is 1990s, mid 1990s, when they had their new program. They just started, and I didn't even know about it. I went to the doctor just so that I could have a doctor on hand, because I was going to be traveling across Europe on sort of an ad hoc experience, camping out a lot, campgrounds and stuff, and on crutches. I thought, hey, it might be wise if I had a doctor that was from a European country that could actually answer questions about my case, rather than having to communicate with someone in the U.S. should I wind up in an emergency room. I don't know what made me think of that. Maybe it's just because I was so fresh out of surgeries and everything, but that's what I was thinking about. But anyway, that doctor prescribed me cannabis. And not only prescribed me cannabis, but said that if at all possible, he'll allow me to have any amount of cannabis that I need. He recommended that I use it as a tea if I could, and he would give me as much as I needed. If I was staying there in Holland, I could have really, maybe benefited from it even differently than I did here in the U.S. Having that kind of availability. But yeah, he said, if you can set aside the pain pills, do it and just use the cannabis. So here, the one doctor is saying, as much cannabis as you want, get rid of the pain pills. And the other doctor is saying, take as many pain pills as you want, just get rid of the cannabis. And you tell me which one was giving political advice and which one was giving medical advice, right?
Exactly. Well, of course, doctors, they can't. Back then, they recommending cannabis could in some cases they could lose their license. So
yeah, they were threatened pretty heavily.
Yeah, they were.
I don't remember what the year was when the drug czar of the United States, remember, it was the head of the Office of National Drug Control Policy, General McCaffrey.
Right.
He came out and he had charts and graphs with Dr. Micaria's picture on it, and he had a little pointer stick poking it saying, this is Cheech and Chong medicine, and we're going to shut it down, and we're going to arrest all the doctors. That didn't quite work out for him, did it? They ran into a brick wall called the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals. But
Right.
They tried, didn't they?
They sure did. And I mean, doctors were literally afraid to. I remember talking with them. They kind of secretly, maybe it would be okay, but I'm not going to get involved in it because I'm not going to lose my license. And that's their bread and butter. If they get their license suspended for that, they're out of business. And so they were really threatened. Well, but you recognize the importance of cannabis, especially for veterans. And how did you start to work with that?
Actually, excuse me. I actually came back from that big trip where I went across Europe and had that experience. And interestingly, just after that, there was the first big international meeting that I ever attended. It was in 1998. And that was the Drug Summit in New York, the UNGAS, it's called, United Nations General Assembly Special Session on Drugs. At that meeting, there was like 78 world leaders, kings, queens, presidents, whatever, in attendance in New York. It was quite a spectacular thing. And that was my first introduction into the UN, was that meeting. I actually met up with, went on a little pilgrimage, if you will, all the way out to Oregon, because I knew that everybody was kind of be in one place. I was able to get Jack and Jack Hare, of course, Dennis Perone, Chris Conrad, and a couple other people all in a little circle, smoke a joint and talk about this meeting at the UN the next year and ask, their advice. And interestingly, I think to this day, it's very interesting to me that they didn't really have anybody to connect me to. I thought for sure they would say, oh, this person or that person has been doing this forever, just go help them, they'll do it, But no, it was like, oh, that's an interesting idea. Go to it, man. See what you can do. That was my mandate, to go to the UN and see what I can do for the cannabis movement. And the next year, showed up in New York. I brought in several organizations with me, one of them being Marijuana Policy Project. I helped them get a badge to get in. I helped the Lennis Worth with Virginians Against Drug Violence and Patients at a Time we brought in as well. And when I went in there, with Virginians Against Drug Violence, and we had a side event with Marijuana Policy Project, and they put me up as a speaker, and I'm there at the UN, and I'm thinking, what do I say? And it just struck me to talk about it from a veteran's perspective. And that was literally the first time that I'd ever really, looked at the work from a veteran's perspective and started talking about it from that perspective. But it was really quite simple. Here I am, a military vet of the United States, on holiday, if you will, over in Holland, over in the Netherlands. They don't owe me anything, but yet they seem to respect my medical needs more than my own country. And back in the United States, even though it seems to be what the evidence and a wise treatment plan would call for, I'm warned against cannabis for basically arbitrary reasons, and it seemed very disrespectful. That was the first time I'd ever really spoken to the issue as a vet. But it wasn't until later, negotiating the the pain contracts and the myriad offices of the Office of Legal Counsel, and the back and forth that we had, sort of as veterans in the States, working in the States, a lot to do with the initiative that my colleague Marty Chilcutt championed out there in Michigan to legalize medical marijuana, and tying that into Veterans Affairs. But anyway, long story short, we were able to basically corner the VA because they were in an ethical dilemma. They had to treat the veterans based on their medical need and by the standards of medical care and by basic standards of ethics guide them. But yet they were pulling this legalistic crap with cannabis. Oh, it's Schedule 1. Those two things conflicted with each other. And we found the point at which they conflicted and sort of pressed on it. And out came, at the other end of the process, the VA policy on medical marijuana.
So how did you actually get this policy written? I mean, did you write it up? Who wrote up the policy and got it through and got it approved?
Yeah, well, see, the parts of it, the moving parts of it are basically three parts. And the first part starts very early, 10 years earlier, with me meeting up with Dr. Mikaria for the first time, as it says in my bio, and learning about how cannabis was used, not just by me. I mean, I know my case, but it's not very useful to know your own case if it's, a one-off, if you're a rather unique person, but my case isn't unique. It's very similar to a lot of other patients who have very similar experiences with using cannabis for pain or some painful condition, and then having the experience of being able to mitigate or reduce that pill count by using cannabis. Knowing that, and then also working with people like Ethan Nadelman and others, and recognizing that there was a freight train coming of drug policy. Mid-90s, Anti-Drug Abuse Act and stuff is what is now historically set us back as a nation, and is what has put the big black mark on Biden's record that he's still to this day trying to overcome. All comes from that time period. And of course, what was that? That was the crack days, and it was a very crazy moment for drug policy. But what did it mean for medical marijuana patients? It meant that increasingly the doctors were being put on the spot to sort of police their patients, make them sign a contract that they wouldn't use any illegal drugs. And as long as marijuana was Schedule 1, it was considered an illegal drug, just like crack or whatever else. So for that reason, I saw those two things like heading to each other, like, two freight trains. Marty, on the other side, and what to make that, sort of complete that leg of the stool, I worked that complaint up about, I basically, I refused to sign the contract, but I also refused to just go away. They needed to treat me, and they were put in a spot where evidently no other vet had put them in, where they had to treat me because it was ethical to treat me, and it wasn't ethical to deny me treatment. And it wasn't really possible for them to actually deny me treatment based on just simply not signing the contract. By violating, quote, violating the contract, that would be one thing, but not signing it, that was something quite different.
That's very interesting.
I
should say that's very interesting, because here, where we were dealing with a number of veterans who needed pain medication, and the VA here was telling them, if you use cannabis, we're going to kick you out of the pain medication program.
Yeah, well, that's another leg of the stool. I'll get to that in a second.
Okay.
But before I get to that leg of the stool, back to Marty Chilcutt and his experience and what was so important about that. He started the marijuana initiative in Michigan, and then handed it off to Marijuana Policy Project. But he stayed very active in the initiatives. Basically, anytime there was a story anywhere in Michigan, in any of the newspapers, any of the TV stations, he would weigh in as a veteran and from the veteran's perspective. And he got published a considerable amount of time between the time he handed off the initiative and when it actually passed. And he was so effective, in fact, that when it did pass, the first thing the TV studios did was stick a microphone in the Department of Veterans Affairs spokesperson's face in there in Kalamazoo, I guess it was, or no, excuse me, I take it back, in Detroit. And the Detroit spokesperson said something really interesting. He said that, well, no veteran should be punished, certainly, for using medical marijuana. If they're using it pursuant to a doctor's orders, they certainly should be able to do that without being punished at the VA. And that was VA policy. Well, that was new to us. I had been working all the way through the system with my complaint. Marty had a lot of communications with the VA. We didn't know of any such communication or such a policy. So that started us communicating with the legal counsel of the VA. And the third leg of the stool was actually a couple of patient cases. One was out in Montana, which was a veteran that was going head to head with their administration there at the hospital. And it was just a very clear case where the veteran was being denied treatment based on using medical marijuana, legal, doctor recommended medical marijuana. And then the other case was interesting to you, and it goes back to your story. It was out in California. And it not only was in California, but it was in a clinic that was being run by a doctor that should know better. It was a doctor that was part of the CMCR, the California Medical Cannabis Research Group. Because of that, I handled it a little differently than I would usually handle a case like that, where I would, just sort of, educate the staff and do the work of, just sort of figuring out what was going on. We knew what was going on. It had to be some sort of political thing if this is a doctor that knows better and they're implementing a rule like that. I reached out to the CMCR leadership to talk to the doctor, which at first Dr. Grant is the head of the CMCR, said, yeah, sure, I'll do that. And then came back and said, no, I really can't talk to the doctor. I should talk to the clinic. And then it wound up, I should just talk to the facility. I should talk to the chief of staff. And then it was like, no, maybe if you connect me with the directorate, that would be better. And when I connected him with the pain management directorate that I had reached through my fight on the pain contracts in Washington, D.C., they clicked together like a key in a lock. Evidently, the two doctors went to school together and had a very good rapport. And evidently, they were working on a sort of a operating procedures or a policy at that level for quite a while. But it was meeting up with Dr. Grant and getting the full access to the CMCR that seemed to allow them to finish writing it. You asked if, who wrote it. That's who wrote it. It was the Pain Management Directorate and the Ethics Committee of the VA together with the CMCR is who wrote it. But why was it released? That's another story, because they weren't going to release it. I actually had a letter from the Undersecretary of Health that I had gotten as a result of our communication with the General Counsel. General Counsel referred me over to the Undersecretary of Health, who answered my question. It was a hypothetical question that Fred Gardner actually helped me write. And it was a very simple question that we worked a lot on. And it was, if you're a veteran and you're using medical cannabis under doctor's recommendation, legal under state law, should you be punished at the VA for that? Should you have some is there a punishment that's levied against veterans in that circumstance? Because it would seem so from who we're talking to inside the system. And that was a legalistic question completely from our perspective, but it was handed off to the Undersecretary of Health, who, to our surprise, answered it in a rather beautiful way. He said, he quoted ethics, and he quoted the status that should be afforded the treatment based on the standards of medical care, et cetera, saying that, things like you should never be punished and it should be treated like any other medicine. They make, decisions with, the positive benefits, weighed against the risks, et cetera. Rational stuff, never heard that before from the VA. Yeah. And I actually reached out to a friend of mine, Steve Fox, down in Colorado, trying to figure out if we could get someone to publish this letter that I'd gotten from the Undersecretary of Health, because if I put it on the website, nobody would believe I got it. And he actually connected me with a writer from the New York Times that was trying to get on the cover of the New York Times for a while, evidently. And he had actually written a story that he thought could get on the cover of the New York Times about how post-traumatic stress and cannabis were handled in New Mexico versus Colorado. There's a big disparity there I could talk about if you want to know about. But anyway, yeah, he was able to get the interest of the New York Times cover to do this story. And it was the interest of the cover editors, above the fold editors from the New York Times cover, that actually were able to push the VA into releasing the policy. In fact, the VA came back and the New York Times, they called me back and said, hey, would it be okay with you if we held on to the story for a few days? The VA has said that they are in a position to release a policy right now if we'll just not run this letter. If we'll do the story about the new VA policy instead, they'll release the policy. Is that cool with you? And I was like, yeah, that's very cool with me. But you have to understand, that was the first Obama administration, and there was every reason to believe that they were not going to release something like that until the beginning of the next term. And I can't take that risk. You know, now we look back and say, of course, he got reelected, but I couldn't take that risk that he was going to get reelected. I had to, you know, work on things when I can and do things when I can. And I'm glad we got the VA policy when we did. It wasn't appropriate to, you know, push it and let it be a second term.
Well, it was a major accomplishment. It really was for a government agency, a big government agency, a veterans group administration, actually saying that medical cannabis is beneficial to veterans and they should be able to use it and not be punished for using it and getting kicked out of medical programs.
I've got a segue for you to scheduling, and I think it's interesting that this comes up. Now, the to you know, sort of corroborate what you just said, the VA policy, the very first version, did indeed talk about how cannabis was useful for various conditions, consistent with the results of the CMCR, which is a very conservative, you know, San Diego, University of California group. And they found, you know, in their findings, very positive results from certain aspects of cannabis treatments. And that was, you know, reflected in the very first VA policy. But Schedule 1 of the Controlled Substances Act says that marijuana has no medical value. And here's the VA policy saying it does. So how long do you think that was able to stand? It actually lasted 1 year. They revised the policy in 2011 to remove any mention of medical marijuana. And in fact, from 2011 on, if you're using marijuana pursuant to a state law and using it legally under the, you know, whatever the regimen is of that state law, that's all it's required for you to be consistent with the VA policy because of scheduling. Because Schedule 1 makes the United States federal government blind to any benefits or risks of medical marijuana.
So let's move forward then. One of the things I really wanted to talk to you about was the rescheduling of marijuana. The Biden administration seems to be is going okay with rescheduling it, but there's a lot of hiccups during the way. But you worked kind of behind the scenes with your veterans organization to help get this change, help get marijuana out of Schedule 1 and put into Schedule 3. No one really knows too much about this story. Could you kind of illuminate us about it?
Well, before I get into that story, since it's got the same tagline, let me fill in the blanks on the history. In 2000, I guess it was 2013, I went into the United States Court of Appeals in Washington, D.C. as a part of the what was called Americans for Safe Access versus the DEA, which was the pickup of the rescheduling case, the rescheduling petition, which normal National Organization to Reform of Marijuana Laws started in 1971, 1972, when the ink was still drying on the Controlled Substances Act. They were already fighting that schedule placement of Schedule 1 and continue to do so to this day. That fight has continued until today, where we're finally seeing the imminent change. But think about that, like 50 years of fighting this case. And I came in as a plaintiff, or whatever it's called, with Kathy Jordan and a few others, but it was actually my veteran's story that I wrote on the periphery of the case notes, and the judges picked up on that, and that's what actually won us standing to fight that another day. It just got us to another point where we lost again, but it's kind of like winning a first down in a football game. You get credit for it even if the game didn't go well, and that's what happened. And you got to understand too, that case was floundering for like a decade, waiting for somebody to win standing. And standing is a big deal in the federal court. If you can't get standing, you can't get before the judge. You can't get to make your case. So that winning standing was a kind of a big little deal. But anyway, bringing us up to the future now, we actually played a pretty big role in this, in behind the scenes. I mean, first of all, it's hard to imagine being where we're at right now without two things. One of them being the hemp law and CBD, and the whole thing with CBD, and I can explain what I mean by that. And then the other was the change in the treaty. Those are two big things, and the treaty change is not insignificant. It normalizes the control over cannabis to make it really completely up to countries how they, to their discretion, how they handle medical marijuana. They can have it as a tight prescription drug if they want, or they can have it totally over the counter with the loosest possible controls.
And you're talking about the single drug convention. You're talking about,
as they're doing a good job, making sure that it's getting into the hands of the patients, and it's not being diverted and whatever. It's up to the country.
I want to let people know that what you're talking about is the Single Drug Convention Treaty of the United Nations.
Yeah, and this is a treaty that was signed in 1961. It actually predates our federal law, and our federal law was written to accommodate that treaty and that relationship. 186 countries, I think, total signed that treaty and agreed to live by the standards. It covers medical and scientific use towards medical. That's what it covers. And it's supposed to standardize medical for these handful of, very dangerous substances like fentanyl and things like that, to help make sure that they're available for patients, and make sure that as much as possible things that they make in the laboratory stay in the laboratory and don't hurt people. And I think if you say the treaty that way, it's like, oh, I get it. That I don't mind that. But what they did was, way back when, they didn't know anything about anything, and they put all these plants in the treaty: poppy, coca, cannabis. And to this date, we're still dealing with the fallout of their mistakes in doing so. It's made it very difficult for people to use cannabis as a traditional medicine in the way that they've used in India or whatever for millennia. So, but anyway, back to our story here in the United States. What happened was, first of all, the CBD, I think that's a really important leg of this. What happened was, we had GW Pharmaceuticals together with the patients that were, sort of instigated by CNN's Dr. Sanjay Gupta reports. Remember when that all broke with CBD?
Right.
And that caused some patients in the United States to push really hard to get to try a new drug that was being formulated. That was a cannabis extract formulation, half CBD, half THC. No, excuse me, I take that back. Full CBD. They have two products. One is half CBD, one half THC, and the other one's just pure CBD. And this was the pure CBD product called Epidiolex. And that product wound up being tried in an emergency FDA trials here in the United States, and succeeding and passing. So it's now an FDA-approved medication for like Dravet syndrome or whatever. And because of that, the FDA made their determination that it shouldn't be scheduled. It wasn't really a drug of abuse, isn't a drug of abuse per se. There's really no reason for it to be scheduled. They went to the DEA and said, what do you say? And the DEA said, well, it can be seen as an extract of cannabis. And again, the treaty didn't know from nothing back then. They didn't know from THC or CBD or whatever in 1961. They just called it extracts of cannabis. And certainly a CBD extract could be considered an extract of cannabis. They said, the lowest we could go is Schedule 5. And what we would have to do is, and what they did, and this was for a time, CBD was no schedule forever, and then for a time scheduled Schedule 5. And what they had to do was they had to write special accommodation for Schedule 5 to deal with treaty obligations. Nothing really major, but reporting requirements of how much you used the year before or next year and stuff like that to satisfy the treaty had to be written into Schedule 5, because all the treaty obligation stuff was written into Schedule 1 and Schedule 2 when they wrote the law. No big deal, really, looking back, but it was something they had to do. And then we legalized hemp. We changed the hemp law in the United States. So now all of a sudden there was a new rationale. It didn't have to be just looking at CBD as potentially an extract of cannabis. You could also look at it as an exempt crop residue of hemp. And they did so. And they took it out of the schedule. And I always love talking about this in this context when people are really scared of schedule change, because I defy you to really point to the day when CBD went from nothing to Schedule 5 and then back to nothing again. It's not really something that interferes with our world, not at the state level, the way we handle medical marijuana. So, and then that brings us back to us, right? The veterans and our role in all this. President Biden, then candidate Biden, said in his campaign that he was going to legalize medical marijuana. He was going to make marijuana Schedule 2. Well, I'm glad he evolved from that position and no longer was pushing for Schedule 2. I'm not exactly sure when he stopped pushing for Schedule 2, and I would love to think that we had some influence on it. But what we did was we actually, the Veterans Action Council patiently waited after the treaty change for the almost automatic change in U.S. policy based on the treaty change. And the reason why we expected this is because, unbeknownst to most of those listening right now, the treaty gets changed all the time, and they add new drugs all the time. And the DEA then changes our U.S. law all the time to accommodate the treaty change. It's written into our federal law that the Attorney General shall change the federal law to accommodate the treaty when the treaty changes, up or down, more or less control. That then triggers the Attorney General's authority to change the U.S. law to accommodate as he or she would feel is appropriate. It's almost exactly how it's written in the law. It's a really big open clause that the Attorney General has used, for all these years to change the law. Within weeks after we would get back from Vienna, after changing the treaty, and they'd add some fentanyl new drug or something like that, the U.S. law would accommodate and be changed. So we watched the clock, and weeks went by and months went by and nothing. Finally, we said, hey, let's reach out to the Attorney General. Well, I don't know if you've ever tried to reach out to the Attorney General, but our response was crickets. And no matter how we tried to talk to the Attorney General, we never got anything back. So we finally, since we have a pretty good working relationship with the White House because of our trips to Vienna and these UN meetings, we often communicate directly with the Office of National Drug Control Policy and or the State Department, INL. It's an International Narcotics Law Enforcement branch. So we reached out to them, our colleagues in government, to ask them to help us reach out to the Attorney General. And they said, okay, we'll set up a meeting and you tell us what you're talking about. And we met with the general counsel of the Office of National Drug Control Policy for like an hour, laid out our case, how we thought that the treaty change certainly was sufficient to trigger the law. Since then, the ONDCP has told us that it was what they had heard, that the treaty change wasn't seen as significant enough to trigger the law change in and of itself. All right, that's what it is, what it may be. But going back to my story, within about a week or so after we met with the White House staff, the president gets on TV and does his whole pardon thing. We knew he was going to do the pardons. We were sort of expecting almost exactly what he did. But then he did something else. He asked the Attorney General to look into this cannabis scheduling and get it done, and use some of the language, I swear to you, from our meeting with the White House staff. And it's pretty cool when that happens. That's something that no one's ever reported on that I know of. Our meeting and the serendipity, if you will, or coincidence, or possibly even input and influence that we had on the process. But I assure you, any influence that we had was only due to stating a very clear, factual, evidence-based argument.
If he restated the same things, that means he was listening in these meetings, and he took that and said, "This makes sense to me," and then he repeated it.
So here we are.
Yeah.
So here we are.
Yeah, so now,
this is a very interesting moment where the President of the United States had never asked for rescheduling before. Which, think about that. President Carter talked about legalizing marijuana, but he never did the low-hanging fruit of just asking for rescheduling. We always, bounce back and forth in the movement, like, why didn't the president do this? Why didn't the president do that? I honestly never even thought about the president just asking for rescheduling. We were always talking about the president just doing it, using executive branch powers to just do it. But asking for it is good too. The thing is, if you look at the DEA's statement that they put out in their docket on their public comment, statement, or whatever you call it, they said that the reason why they're in this situation today and not in 1971. In 1971, when the DEA was pressed by NORML and they were in court, and the Office of Legal Counsel, the DEA, was asked, they said, no, we have to keep it in Schedule 1 or Schedule 2. It can't be moved out of Schedule 1 or Schedule 2 because of the treaty obligations. And the way the DEA says it in their documentation today is, well, they didn't have a choice available to them that we now have, because we now know that we can, create this, what my colleague Shane Pennington calls a bespoke scheduling of Schedule 3, carrying along certain elements of Schedule 1 and Schedule 2 with regard to treaty obligations. Very simply done based on the model that they created when they did CBD. See why that's so important. But yeah, that they're just saying it so matter-of-factly, like this is an option that didn't exist back then. No, it was an option. It was like ruby slippers that Ingersoll, or whatever his name was in 1971, didn't want to click his heels together 3 times and Jew. That's the only reason the option wasn't available to him in 1971. I mean, you're being kind even when you say that.
Well,
in a way, they lied.
Back then, it was totally illegal across the country, and cops were just livid about any kind of thing that would loosen the laws on cannabis. They made so much money off of cannabis prohibition. So all these agencies had all these cops from all across the country, and the FBI and all this kind of stuff, putting pressure on them to never do anything that would allow cannabis to loosen up the ropes that the schedule, being in Schedule 1, put it into.
Well, now you know the mechanics of that, how it actually worked. Yeah. It was by denying an option that was, granted, not an option. It had to be created. It was something that they had to create. Like I said, a bespoke scheduling, Schedule 5, and now we have that model to follow for a bespoke Schedule 3 for cannabis. And it is something that, with time and different staff and the imminence and the necessity of the FDA approval. And I think you're right. I think there's a very plausible argument for that. But you also have to look at the bigger picture, that not just is this the president's first time asking for rescheduling, but it's the first time the FDA approved and agreed. And it's the first time the FDA found this elusive classification, found that cannabis had current accepted medical value in the United States, which is a legalistic term that they had tied to FDA approval. So it wouldn't be approved as an FDA approved drug unless somebody studied it, and you can't study it because it's not it's in Schedule 1,
Right.
and you can't get out of Schedule 1 because it doesn't have any currently accepted medical value, and that means back to around to
but with
number 1 again
with
because it wasn't FDA approved.
but
Perfect catch-22.
with the president of the United States, though, kind of putting his thumb on the scale, essentially telling the FDA to get up and start doing something about it. I think that had something to do with why they came around like that.
Yeah, but that's why I present it the way I do, because I think you can't put any one thing out in front. The hemp and the CBD and that learning curve, the fact that the president and the FDA are weighing in on this, but also what did the FDA say? They're weighing in because they found 30,000 doctors that were recommending cannabis out in the field. That's the success of Prop 215.
Yeah.
30 years later.
Yeah. Well,
so,
Proposition 215 changed the game. It really changed the game and did the. Listen, we're going to run out of time here. Now that it's in Schedule 3, or it's going to be in Schedule 3, how do you think that's going to change things?
Well, it's going to be a monumental change in some small places and not so much of a change in others where we really need change. In other words, we still have to go and reform the laws at the federal level to get rid of criminal sanctions and everything. It's going to be a job that starts with rescheduling. Frankly, it's a job that starts with descheduling or rescheduling. Either one of those would then be the starting point of real criminal justice and reform. And then as far as what the direct impacts are going to be, there's lots of things tied directly to schedule. And one of them is the air quotes on medical marijuana. You take the air quotes off of the legal medical marijuana, and then you get rid of the tax implications, right? The tax implications, IRS code has crippled the legitimate businesses that try to do business in cannabis because they aren't able to, use the regular rules that every other business follows.
They can't deduct their business expenses if it has to do with marijuana.
So that in and of itself is a big deal. Veterans, right? We have Veterans Affairs doctors that aren't able to participate in the state programs, write recommendations or anything because of Schedule 1. A lot of people that live in some sort of government housing or some sort of on a transplant list, or even the gun laws that we were talking about with Hunter Biden. Once it's rescheduled, it's no longer a Schedule 1 drug, and you're using it legally under a doctor's recommendation. Will the ATF issue new guidance? I would hope they would. So let's see. We'll see what's going to happen. I don't think there's going to be any real major change in the way we do things under the state programs, because those are state programs, and they were set up with the protection of the constitutional division of state and federal powers.
Yeah, you're right. It's in some ways it's more symbolic than anything else, but symbolism really counts. And I think you've seen that with the way the things you've done here, the changing of the United Nations Treaty, getting the VA to allow it to be used by veterans. The symbolism that happens is one of the things that's helped propel its acceptance, where now 80% of all people think it certainly has medical use, and the majority of people, including Republicans, think it should just be legal altogether. Well, listen, Michael, we've got to get running here. We got to wrap the show up there. Is there something you can say if people wanted to contact you? Do you have an email address or something you can give out?
Yeah, Veterans Action Council is the primary group that I work with these days, a voluntary group. Veterans Action Council at gmail.com. And happy to hear from folks. I would add one last little thing. Don't be afraid of big pharma. I think it's possible that Schedule 3 would make it a little bit easier and encourage more, new drug development dollars. But there's been nothing to stopping big pharma from looking into cannabis up till now.
Okay, Michael,
as exemplified by the product I was just talking about. So
we got to wrap it up. Thank you so much for joining us on here. Keep working it. You've made some of the major changes, and we thank you so much for all you've done. Okay, we got to wrap the show up. I just want to mention real quickly, hey, if you like the show, if you want to help the show, you'd like to be a sponsor on the show and reach out to all our listeners, give us a call here at KCA Radio and ask for Mark Westwood. Thank you so much. Talk to you next week. Our guest is going to be David Diskins from the Cannabis Appreciation Day. It's going to be an amazing show. See you next week. Take care.
KCAA Loma Linda.